Hi, I'm Jennifer Kelman, the creator of Mrs Pinkelmeyer and her lovable dog, Mupus McGlinden. Together they inspire self-esteem in children through their love, warmth, and silliness. I'd love to introduce you to my characters and tell you a little story about Mrs Pinkelmeyer and the development of her. Many years ago I was taking care of my nephew while he was dealing with separation anxiety while my sister and brother-in-law were out of town. Whatever I did to calm his fears, I was unsuccessful. Until I picked up the phone and pretended to call a lady that out of my imagination came Mrs. Pinkelmeyer. I didn't give her my New York accent because I didn't think that would be funny. I gave her the British accent, and here's what she said. "My name is Mrs. Pinkelmeyer, and you've called me while I'm making a delicious rump roast for dinner." And what do you think happened? Tears disappeared, laughter ensued, and Mrs. Pinkelmeyer came to my rescue and to the rescue of my nephew, to all of our delight. Since then, creating that lovable character, I've created a complete product line around her. And we have here the Mrs. Pinkelmeyer and Mupus McGlinden plush singing doll. I made Mupus detachable. And Mrs. Pinkelmeyer, when squeezed in her belly, also plays 45 seconds of her signature song, Mrs. Pinkelmeyer Makes You Happy. We have the Mrs. Pinkelmeyer music CD with lullabies and Mrs. Pinkelmeyer's version of disco called Pinkelmeyer Dance, and the Mrs. Pinkelmeyer book series, which I've authored. The first book tells the story of the mistaken phone call that Mrs. Pinkelmeyer received way back when, where Mrs. Pinkelmeyer and Mupus McGlinden burn the rump roast. You need to be able to roll your R's. My second book that I've authored in the series is Mrs. Pinkelmeyer and Mupus McGlinden Prance into New York City. And by demand, the small Mupus wasn't enough for my customers, and so we created a large, lovable, huggable Mupus McGlinden. Everybody needs a Mupus McGlinden in their lives, as well as a Mrs. Pinkelmeyer. Mrs. Pinkelmeyer's collection would not be complete with the Mrs. Pinkelmeyer and Mupus McGlinden bobblehead. They are lovable and they are wonderful, and this is a great, cute little gift for your desktop. What we also have here playing on our screen is the first Mrs. Pinkelmeyer Cartoon. And what it does in this cartoon is it shows kids that you can have healthy self-esteem no matter what. And here we have her putting her rump roast, her famous rump roast, in the oven. And just like Mrs. Pinkelmeyer in her silly fashion, forgets about the rump roast as she's dancing along with Mupus. But you will see in a moment that she doesn't care very much because she is just happy to be Mrs. Pinkelmeyer.
Thank you.